Yeah, I think we did announcements, prayer, and we're going to have the message today. It's going to be on the tabernacle. And we set the tabernacle up in the middle of the church. It has a box that covers us up. It was down in the basement, and one of the days the ladies was readying up, tidying up, cleaning, and Wilma said, "What's that thing there sitting on the floor?" And I said, "Well, that's a model of the tabernacle." I said, "Some Sunday we'll have a lesson on the tabernacle." And so that is this Sunday. Today we're going to do that. And when I was in youth group back in the 60s, we made this model of the tabernacle. We bought a kit that had all the pillars and everything. We had to make the furnishings out of cardstock, and so we made that. So that tabernacle sitting before you is about 50-some years old. And this is what God told Moses to make when the children of Israel left Egypt and were wandering in the wilderness. And so, Wilma, you might want to come up. We set it up on top of we made a cover over it so it doesn't get damaged. And we set it up on the table on top of the cover so everybody could see it. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I did this about 5 years ago. I looked it up. It was about 5 years ago I did this. The PowerPoint presentation was on our old laptop computer, which started acting up. So we ended up having a IT guy, computer guy, look at it. And he said, "Oh, that laptop, it's old. Your battery's about dead on it. It won't hold a charge. You need a new laptop." So we bought the new laptop. And we ended up getting the old laptop fired up so we could get the program, the PowerPoint, off the old laptop onto the new laptop. Brought it over, went to try it out, plugged it in, and it wouldn't plug in. It had a different connection on the new laptop than it did on the old laptop. So the first of the month, I had a meeting of the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors in Lancaster. And we have an IT guy on staff. And if I have a computer, they give us a tablet, so when we have a virtual meeting, we can talk to everybody on the tablet. And lots of times I have to call them, Andrew Muffer. I have to call them and say, "Andrew, I can't hear anybody." And they'll say, "Well, get down in the corner, there's a little icon there, you click on that, and then you can turn it up." He's very patient because most of the time we have a meeting, I have to call him to get the thing working. And for me, it's frustrating, but for him, it's real easy. So we took our new laptop, we took our old laptop, took it down to the meeting, and I said to Andrew, "Andrew, I'm doing a presentation on the tabernacle, and I can't get it to come up because I don't have the right connections. I can't get it plugged into the video screens." He said, "Okay, what room are you staying in?" "We're in room 605 or whatever room was." "Okay, I'll be over." Come over, sit down 5 minutes. He said, "You need a connector. You need this type of connector to this other type of connector with a male end." And he looked it up and said, "They have them at Staples for $10. Mary got on and looked it up on Amazon. She found one for $7. We ordered it, and it came in. Come over here. Mary said, "I don't know whether that's going to work." Plugged it in, hooked it up, and you see the tabernacle on the screens. So I'm wearing today my red PSAT shirt in honor of Andrew because he helped us taking care of, and I have the PSAT's emblem on that. I have 3 of these shirts that we wear at different functions. Actually, I have about 13 or 14 shirts that they've given me along the way. So anyways, Andrew, is a great guy. He's very patient. He's a Christian. His two sons are youth pastors. And we got to talking about this. How's your sons doing? How's the youth pastors? And he said, yeah, my son is a youth pastor at a church south of Lancaster. And get this. He said, every Wednesday night they have at least 150 kids come out to their youth service. 150 kids. Wow. Isn't that something? So anyways, thank you. Thank you, Andrew, for getting this up. And so I want to talk about the tabernacle. I want to give you a little history on the tabernacle, a little what came about. We have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham, God called him to leave the city of Ur and go to a place that he'd show him. And he showed him a place to go to the promised land. And because of that, God told Abram that he'd make him into a great nation. So he had a son, Isaac. Isaac had a son, Jacob. Jacob ended up having 12 sons. They became the founders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And, you know, there was the 12 sons. They got in little spats. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. Joseph was Jacob's favorite. He gave him a coat of many colors, and it kind of made his other 10 older brothers, because he had a younger brother, it made his 10 older brothers jealous. And they seen him coming one day when he was out. They was taking care of the sheep, watching the flocks, and so they seen him coming, and they said, oh, there's that dreamer, there's that, let's get rid of him. So they took him, and they sold him to a caravan going to Egypt. And he ended up being sold into slavery in Egypt. Now Joseph was a good interpreter of dreams, and it just so happened that the Pharaoh had a dream, and he had a dream that there were 7 big fat cows that came out of the Nile River, and then there were 7 skinny, scrawny cows that came out of the Nile River. And then he had another dream that there were 7 fat grains of wheat that came, and then there were 7 scrawny little grains of wheat, and the 7 little grains devoured the 7 fat grains. And he couldn't. The Pharaoh was troubled, and he couldn't figure out what the dream meant. And so, in prison, somebody said the baker who had a dream interpreted by Joseph while he was in prison. And he said, well, there's a guy in prison that can interpret dreams. And so Pharaoh summoned for him, and he was brought into Pharaoh's court, and Pharaoh told him his dreams, and Joseph said, well, the 7 fat cows and the 7 fat grains represent 7 years of plenty. And the 7 scrawny cows and the 7 little grains make 7 years of famine. And the 7 years of famine will eat up the 7 years of plenty. And so the Pharaoh said, well, what should we do? And Joseph said, well, you need to take and store up grain when it's 7 years of plenty, to have enough grain for the 7 years of famine. And so Pharaoh put him in charge of that. He ended up becoming like the prime minister of Egypt. And he stored up grain. And when the 7 years of famine came, his brothers who were in the land of Canaan, there was a famine, they were out of food, so they came to Egypt to buy grain. And it ended up, they were reunited. It ended up Joseph invited them to come and live in Egypt. And so the 10 brothers ended up coming to Egypt, settling in Egypt, and God blessed them. Their families grew. They multiplied, became a great people. And it ended up the Pharaoh was afraid of them. He was afraid that the Israelites were going to take over the Egyptians and take over Egypt. And so he made them into slaves. And they were in slavery in Egypt for 430 years. And then God called Moses. Great story. Great story of Moses. He called Moses. Moses was raised in Egypt. He left Egypt. He was a shepherd watching the sheep, and he seen a burning bush, but the bush wasn't burning, but it looked like it was on fire. And God spoke to him and told him that he wanted him to go to Egypt and to lead his people to freedom. And so Moses and his brother Aaron went to Egypt. And they went to the Pharaoh and said, "The Lord says to let my people go. Let them to go to the wilderness and to worship the Lord." And of course the Pharaoh, he liked the slaves, so he didn't want to let them go. So God sent 10 plagues upon Egypt. The water turned to blood. They had frogs. They had gnats. They had swarms of flies. Their cattle died. And after each plague, the Pharaoh would get a hold of Moses and say, "Take this plague away." And the Lord would take it away. And then the Lord, the Bible says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he wouldn't let the Israelites leave. After the death of the cattle, they had boils and sores. They had hail and fire, hailstones that came down like fire. They had locusts, which is grasshoppers that eats everything. They had darkness. They were plagued with darkness when the sun didn't shine. And the very last plague was the death of the firstborn son. And to keep the Israelites from losing their firstborn sons, Moses told them to take and kill a lamb, and to take the blood and put it on the doorpost and on the post above the door of their homes. And then when the death angel came across the land of Egypt, the death angel would see the blood on the doorpost and on the door overhead, and he would pass over that house. And so when the death angel came, he passed over the house of the Israelites. But yet, they took the firstborn of the houses of the Egyptians. And their Israelites celebrated that. They called it Passover. And I think the Jews still celebrate Passover today. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, it was Passover time. When he hung on the cross, it was a time of Passover, because Jesus became our Passover lamb. And so, when the firstborn died, the 10 plagues, Pharaoh had enough, and he said, "Okay, get out of here. Moses, take your people, leave, go out in the wilderness, do whatever you want to do, get out of here. I want rid of you." So Moses left with the children of Israel. And they went into the wilderness, and they was camped. God led them by a pillar of fire at night and pillar of clouds in the daytime. And he led them to the Red Sea. And they were camped adjacent to the Red Sea. And Pharaoh got to thinking, he said, "Geez, I lost all my slaves. I won't have anybody to build my monuments, to build my temples." And so he rounded up his army, and he said, "Let's go after the Israelites and bring them back." And they were at the Red Sea. There was nowhere to go. Pharaoh is coming at them with his army and chariots from the land. And they were at the Red Sea. They didn't have boats. They didn't have ships. They didn't have any way to cross the Red Sea. What were they going to do? God told Moses to stretch his staff out over the Red Sea. And he did that. And the Red Sea opened up. It parted. Can you imagine that? Red Sea parting. Water on this side, water on that side. The Israelites was able to go through the parting on dry ground. And they made it to the other side. And Pharaoh said, oh, let's take the army and let's go get them. And so Pharaoh's army and his chariots, they all went through the Red Sea. And when the Israelites got the other side, the sea came back. And Pharaoh wasn't drowned, but his army was drowned. His soldiers, his horses, his chariots. They were all drowned in the Red Sea. And so then the Israelites ended up wandering in the wilderness. And God told Moses, I'll get to my computer here, and you see a picture of the tabernacle. Exodus, figure out how to do this. Next slide. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Trying to get the slides to move. All right, Mary, can't get these slides to move.
Enter.
Enter. There we go. Enter. Thank you, Mary. Exodus 25, 8 through 9. And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst, according to all that I have showed you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle and all its furniture. You shall make it. So God told Moses to make a tabernacle. Tabernacle, one we have set up here, it had an outer court. The outer court was 75 feet wide, 150 feet long. And they didn't measure in feet in that day. They were measuring in cubits. And a cubit was from the tip of your fingers to your elbow. They would lay that out. Of course, if you was a big guy, you probably had a bigger cubit than a little guy. But it's approximately 18 inches. So the tabernacle had an outer court. It was made of post. It had fine linen. It had a gate at the end. Inside the high court was the tabernacle, the framework, and the tabernacle and everything. The tabernacle consisted of 2 rooms. It was 15 cubits, or it was 10 cubits by 20 cubits by 10 cubits. I think I got that right. Anyway, so it's 15 feet wide, 30 feet long, 15 feet high. It consisted of the 2 rooms. It consisted of the room of the holy place, which was the first room. And then the second room was the holiest place, or called the Holy of Holies. And it was 10 cubits wide, 10 cubits long, and 10 cubits high. It was a perfect cube. And so there we have a picture of the courtyard and the tabernacle. It was made, the framework was made from acacia wood, overlaid with gold, with silver bases. And acacia wood was a wood that's native to the regions. The trees grow to about 20 feet tall, and it's a hardwood. It was overlaid with gold. The bases were made that it set into. They were made out of silver. The altar and the laver was made out of brass or bronze. And where did they get this gold? Here they were in the wilderness. Well, God told the people before they left Egypt to ask for gold and jewelry. He told them that he'd see that they got paid for their years of slavery. And so they asked the Egyptians to give them jewelry, and to give them gold. And And the Egyptians had faced all these 10 plagues, and they were, oh man, we want rid of these people, we want rid of these plagues. So they gave them gold. And when it came to making the tabernacle, they asked the people to give offerings, and they give them enough. They give enough gold and silver to make the tabernacle. How much did it cost? It probably, if today's figures, tabernacle would have cost $10 to $50 million. There's 3 tons of gold, 5 tons of silver, and 4 tons of bronze. So it was kind of an expensive endeavor. And then they were to make coverings to cover it. The first covering was, and we just have a white cover on our model, we didn't embroider it. It was a fine linen that was embroidered by angels, and it made up the ceiling inside the tabernacle. The second was woven goat's hair that covered it. The third was ram skins dyed red. I took this thing down for men's prayer breakfast at the Plaza Restaurant some probably 20 years, 30 years ago. And I gave the presentation. And Red Davis, who was a teacher at AC Valley and a supply pastor, we had him speak here different times. He said, don't forget about the red. Because Red Davis had red hair, and they called him Red Davis. I'm wearing a red shirt today. What do we think of? I see there's a red hoodie back there. What do we think of when we see red? We think of blood. And so the red covering would remind the people of the blood that would be shed. And then the outer layer was waterproof skins. So that we have at the tabernacle. And how did they move this thing? You know, there's a lot of stuff to move. Of course, the Levites took care of it. They were the priestly tribe. And they carried the furnishings on golden poles that went through rings, and they carried them on their shoulders. And I'm guessing there was probably hundreds of priests that did that, and they probably took turns. Okay, we'll carry this down here so far, somebody else will carry it. And they had wagons that they would carry the framework and the coverings and the posts. They had wagons that they'd use. And the tabernacle was set up in the middle camp. It was set up, and the 12 tribes of Israel would set up around it. They would camp around it, 3 tribes on each side. The Levites were probably camped nearest to the tabernacle. And so inside the tabernacle we have the altar of burnt offering. Inside the courtyard we have the laver of brass, which was a big brass water bowl. We have the candlestick, the menorah. Inside the holy place, we have the table of shewbread. We have the altar incense. And then in the most holy, the holiest holies, we had the Ark of the Covenant. And so there's a picture that maybe a model set up at what the tabernacle would have looked like in the wilderness. And I think you're seeing it on the screens. That's a good thing. There was offerings of sheep. Gary and Barb's granddaughter's with us today, and she raises sheep. So there's offerings of sheep, goats, and bulls. The owner of the sheep, and it had to be your best. God wanted your best. You couldn't say, well, I've got this sickly sheep, he's going to die, so I'll take him down to the tabernacle and offer him as a sacrifice because he's going to die anyways. No. God wanted you to bring your best. And they would take their sacrifice, their animal, to the gate of the tabernacle, and they would lay their hands on that animal, symbolizing, laying their hands on, symbolizing transferring their sin to that animal. And then the priest would come out, and they would take that animal in, and they'd offer him on the altar as a sacrifice for forgiveness of that person's sin. So the gate was 30 feet wide, and it was the only door. The average person probably never went inside the courtyard, just the priest. Jesus said that he was the door to the sheepfold. He also said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. First thing you saw in the courtyard was a brazen altar, and the sacrifice would have been lifted up and put on the altar, and there it would have been burnt, and the aroma of it burning would rise up to the Lord. And just as the sacrifice was lifted up and put in the altar, Jesus was lifted up on the cross. Then we have the brazen laver. It was a wash bowl. And had water in it. The priest would wash their hands and feet before they went into the holy place. And there we have it set up, the altar and the laver. You can see the priest there. And then we have the holy place. And it was a front room. And inside the holy place we have the table of shewbread, the candlestick, candelabra, or the menorah, and we have the altar of incense. Table of shewbread. This was a table that held 12 loaves of bread. It was bread of presence was another name for that bread. 12 loaves of unleavened bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel. It was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never hunger nor thirst. The 12 loaves of shewbread was replaced every Sabbath. The priest would eat the loaves, and then they were replaced to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. We have the golden candlestick, the menorah. It was the only light. It was made of solid gold, had 7 lamps that burnt olive oil for light. It was the only light in the tabernacle, in the holy place. There was no windows. It was made of 7. We have 7 days in a week, right? Because God created heaven and earth in 6 days, but the 7th day he rested. So in the Bible, the 7 is the perfect number. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. And then we had the altar of incense. It was made of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. Coals from the bronze altar would be taken in and placed on this altar, and then there would be incense poured over those coals, and there would be smoke and a fragrance that would rise up to heaven, and that would represent the prayers of the people going to God. And it was before the veil in the Holy of Holies. We don't have to offer incense today because Jesus is our intercessor to the Father. He's the one that takes our prayers to God the Father. And then we have the veil that was in front of the Holy of Holies. This veil separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. And when they later built King Solomon's temple, they had a great veil in the temple. We went from the tabernacle to Solomon's temple, and back the Israelites drifted away. After King Solomon, the country of Israel was split in two. 10 tribes to the north become Israel, 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, to the south become Judah. And of course Jerusalem was in the south. It was in the country of Judah. And when the people had good kings that followed the Lord and worshiped God, then the people would worship God. If they got a bad king that led them away from worshiping God, then they led away from worshiping God and ended up worshiping idols. And so because of that, God let King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came and defeated Israel. And when he did that, King Solomon's temple was destroyed. And the Jewish people were taken into captivity. They lived 70 years in captivity in the land of Babylon. And that's where we have the story of Daniel and the lion's den, story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And then they were able to return back to Israel, and they rebuilt the temple. And this time it was called Ezekiel's temple. And we're told that the young men was joyful and praised the Lord because they rebuilt the temple. But the old men wept because the old men that could remember King Solomon's temple, they wept because Ezekiel's temple wasn't as magnificent as Ezekiel's temple. And then in Jesus' day, King Herod, wanting to please the Jewish people and the priests and the leaders, he built Herod's temple. And the veil in Herod's temple, I have to take a slide here. Anyways, the veil in Herod's temple, when Jesus died on the cross, it was rent in two from the top to the bottom, signifying that no longer did they have to go into the Holy of Holies, that you could go directly to Jesus and seek forgiveness. And then inside the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. It was the most sacred piece of furniture